Open your textbooks to page 151 and look at number 1 of self-test 9-1. Now this is what you're going to be doing for your workbook assignment as per usual. Now instead of just focusing on 6/4 chords, we also need to look a little bit about how to do a Roman numeral analysis on real music. We talked about this a little bit, but it's going to get a bit more complicated. So let's just go through this. What you want to do first is always determine the key. Based on this key signature, 2 flats, that means I could be in B flat major or G minor. Scanning through this, first of all, I see a lot of accidentals. If we were in G minor, the raised leading tone would be F sharp. And I do see an F sharp here, and I see one here as well. Now that's only 2, so that's not really a great indicator. But if I look through, what do I see more of? B's, B flats, or G's? I see a lot of G's right here, especially in that bass. See how that arpeggiates G, B, D? So that's essentially arpeggiating the tonic. So best bet is G minor. So once we've determined that, I want you always to write it down here. Oops. You can do G, lowercase, and always put it right there, right before the Roman numeral analysis starts. Now you want to determine the harmonic rhythm. You want to look at these pieces more generally now. Take a look at this first measure. Now, we don't have a bass, so what are we to do in that case? We actually only have one type of pitch, a D. What is this in real music? This is kind of a pickup of sorts, right? It is. It's an anacrusis because we don't have the full amount of beats in this measure. So you don't even want to count that. It doesn't have enough strength to be counted as a chord. And that's just something you want to look at as a musician. Just think logically about these things. If we only have one pitch, it has no weight to it. That's not a chord. It's an ornamentation, an anacrusis, or something else. So let's look at this next measure. Now here we have more beefy notes there. So what you want to do first is do a pitch analysis, a pitch inventory. What pitches do you have here? Well, if we just look at this first half of a beat, we have a G and a B. Now the problem there is we're not looking at this generally enough, okay? Sometimes we don't put a chord every single time the bass note changes, okay? If we look at this in more general sense, we'll see, okay, the bass, we can see that it has G, B flat, and D, and it keeps repeating those. It's arpeggiating them for this first measure. That means that first measure most likely is going to be one chord in itself. We're not going to change chords in that measure. So do a pitch analysis of that then, of all of the pitches in that measure. Like I said before, just looking at the bass, G, B flat, D, all throughout. That gives us a pretty good guess that we're going to have a tonic chord. Look at the treble clef. Here's our B flat. Now here we have some other pitches, an A and an F sharp. What does that mean? That could mean that we have a 5 chord, right? A D chord, D, F sharp, A, but without a D. You also have to look at where these pitches fall on the beat and how long they're held. These are very quick notes right here, this triplet figure, okay? Very fast. They don't fall on a strong beat. They're on the weak beat. Therefore, we're going to call those non-chord tones. And a non-chord tone is a pitch that does not belong to the chord. It acts as ornamentation, as a flourish. So we're going to count this A and the F sharp as just a flourish. That's in the workbook, they put parentheses around those, so that's what we would do. We would not count those in our chord or in our pitch inventory. Okay? Again, you just need to think as a musician. What is this overall feeling of that entire measure? Are you really going to feel a chord change for that very quick beat? No. What you're going to feel here is a 1 chord for the entire measure. Now, you do not need to re-articulate that. Okay, just because the bass changes here, that does not mean the inversion changes. Because again, we're arpeggiating. The full feeling of this measure is a tonic chord root position with this G in the bass being the bass note as well as the root. Okay, so what you can do is you can just simply have the 1 there. You can also put a horizontal line all the way to the next measure. Connect that. I couldn't do it on here, but it would be connected to show that that 1 is withheld for that entire measure. All right, what do we have next? Just looking at this again, now we have a chord change for the entire measure. You can tell a lot by looking at the bass note. The bass here mimics what we saw in this measure, so this is probably going to be 1 chord for the entire measure again. Take a pitch inventory. We have a G, C, E flat, and those are all the pitches that we have. So how do you stack that into even thirds to make a chord? C, E flat, G. Hopefully this is becoming quicker to you now as we get more complicated. So if we have a C chord, what is that in the key of G minor? That would be a 4, and because the G is the lowest bass note and gets the strong beat, it would be a 4-6-4. So there's our 6-4 chord right there. What kind of 6-4 chord would that be? Well, just looking at it, again, this arpeggiation, it's kind of just an ornamentation, right? The real feeling of these beats are the pitch on the down beats, pitch on the strong beats, okay? So if we have this G right here, another one there, here's our 6-4 chord still on that G, and another G, and what do we have next? A G. That's going to be our pedal 6-4 chord, okay? That's because that bass note stays the same. Now again, even though the bass note actually moves, the overall feeling of that bass note, it's grounded with that G. Let's look at the next measure. Here we have, it looks like the same thing, right? C, E flat, G. Here's an E flat. These triplets, non-chord tones. Treat them as a flourish. So this is also going to be a 4-6-4, which is a pedal. Now, for this, again, you would want to possibly put that horizontal line in there. When you change measures, you'll want to re-articulate that chord again. It's just more helpful for the performer. You do not need to re-articulate or rewrite that chord if it's, halfway through the measure. But once you start the new measure, it's kind of a new thought. So then you would repeat that chord. And this is going to stay all the way throughout. You do not have to put the horizontal lines there. It's up to you. Next chord, G, B, D. That would be our tonic again. Root position. Now what about this stuff here? Well, we don't have any bass there, so we're just basically looking at a one pitch line, a melody line. So again, I would say that that's just an ornamentation, something to make the music a bit more interesting. So I would not put a chord there. And then at the very end, look at this as a musician. What do you think you're going to hear here? Here, sorry. So we have a chord here, a big chunky chord in the bass, and then another chunky chord in the bass. So musically, you would definitely hear two different chord changes, one here and one here. Notice how that harmonic rhythm has changed now. Before, the harmonic rhythm was changing every measure. But once we get to this one, it now is changing on every beat. That's just something you have to learn to spot, and you always just want to anticipate what are you going to hear if you were to listen to this. Don't actually play it, but imagine it. So what do we have here? We have an A, C, E flat, and an F sharp. Now we also have a G here, that's going to throw things off, but because that G is so quick and it falls on the offbeat, I would say that G is a non-chord tone. Since the F sharp falls on the strong beat, I would count that in the chord. And I would say that is a 7 diminished 6-5 chord. And that works out really well, right? Because the 1 goes to the 7 diminished. We can never have a 7 diminished in root position. So the fact that it's a first inversion 7th chord means that that is probably right. Always check your chord progressions. If they're weird and they don't make sense, then you're probably doing something wrong. And then we have here a B flat, D, and a G. So that's going to be our one chord in first inversion, and then in the right hand, just a flourish, nothing to count, nothing with any substantial weight. Okay, so this is what you want to do for your homework. Yeah, I think that's about it. Let me know if you have questions, and good luck.